Dr. Mike Salinas. I'm a senior lecturer here in the Department of Sociology at Manchester Metropolitan. My talk today is about behaviours of steroid users and the ways in which their behaviours elevate the risks of use. And we know that there exists significant diversity in terms of behaviours and practices amongst the wider steroid using population. There isn't a typical user or singular pattern of use. So today I want to look at the risk profiles of a particular group of individuals in a particular setting in an independent hardcore gym in the north of England. Now this was an environment where the use of steroids and other IPEDs was not only normalised but actively facilitated by gym members, by staff and by the owner of the gym itself. So I'm interested in the notion that certain subpopulations of steroid users are engaging in practices that heighten the risks of use, whether through almost reckless behaviour or through a sort of hedonistic subculture on shared norms and values that they have. Bit of context first. We know that many steroid users are engaged in risky behaviours. So I just want to draw your attention to two studies. The first being that of Begley and colleagues, and the national survey published in 2017, and the second being Christiansen and colleagues' study of 37 steroid users from 9 different countries. So firstly, looking at the national survey results published in 2017, this was really interesting because it showed that about 3/4 of this sample had consumed alcohol once a month or more, and of those who reported drinking, I think it was about 43% were classified or could be classified as binge drinking when they drink. That's consuming 10 or more units of alcohol in a single session, so about equivalent to a bottle of wine. Further to that, around 47% of respondents had used an illicit psychoactive drug in the previous year. And this is significantly higher than the general UK population, which during that year was 8.3%. So recreational drug use of psychoactive drugs was 6 times higher amongst the individuals here. Another thing worth noting is that a significant proportion of people who first used steroids were teenagers at the time, which again poses risks in terms of the body's natural development and production of hormones during this critical developmental stage. And the other study that I wanted to point to was Christiansen's study, and they looked at 37 people who'd used steroids and came up with what they called the 4 ideal types of users. Now, 2 of these users are worthy of note, particularly for this presentation. The first was the you only live once type. These were generally a bit more reckless in terms of their behaviour, quite hedonistic in their sort of subcultural groupings. They used psychoactive drugs and they experimented with different IPED combinations, different lengths of use. The other group that was engaged in kind of risky behaviours were the athlete types. So many of these individuals would not stop using, but would simply switch between substances rather than taking a break. They also engage in other potentially high-risk behaviours such as using insulin, but for the most part this group viewed these risks as calculated and believed that for the most part they were in control of them, undertaking the right mitigation techniques. So this study is, and the data I'm going to present is based on an ethnography which myself and a number of colleagues undertook a few years ago in an underground-ish independent bodybuilding gym. Now, for further details on it, you can read up on the methodology in the paper Polydrug Use and Polydrug Markets. But just very briefly, this was a male-dominated gym where the vast majority, between 70 and 99%, were users of steroids and other IPEDs. Although this paper is about heightened risk behaviours and practices that might be a concern, the first thing that I want to do is qualify the findings being presented. It has to be stressed that the majority of those we interviewed or spoke to during the field work were actively trying to educate themselves on steroids and the associated harms of these drugs and other IPEDs, safe practices, and also trying to educate themselves in terms of mitigating unwanted side effects. So these weren't passive consumers, nor were they ignorant to the dangers of these drugs. But as we'll see, some did show some willful ignorance towards it. But for the most part, just like Christensen's athletes type, many saw the sort of risks of use as being pretty inevitable, but for the most part calculated. So very briefly, when it came to the risks from injection, everyone we spoke to was really knowledgeable in terms of what the risks were and how best to mitigate it. In terms of the awareness of risk that stem from the use of these drugs, such as damage to the key organs or the cessation of the body's own production of testosterone, again, these guys were really clued up. And again, for the most part, many tried to mitigate these risks either by coming off, having during their cycles, using post-cycle therapies, or avoiding, say, oral tablets. I'll let you read these, or you can pause on the slide, but just these are sort of typical responses in terms of the dangers that arise from either injection practices or through the drugs themselves. So what are the elevated risks then? Well, with that in mind, and the idea that these people were not passive and were trying to educate themselves, let's look at the behaviours which we identified where risks were likely to be elevated. So in order to do this, I've split the findings. Polydrug use, poor and inconsistent regimens, medical conditions, and poor injection practices. So let's look at polydrug use first. This was the finding that the vast majority of those we spoke to were using, a plethora of different image and performance enhancing drugs. Human growth hormone, the stacking of multiple steroids, oral and injectable for the most part, and other things like insulin, amongst, I think it was 3 of the 20 that we'd spoken to. So there was a real mix of enhancement drugs, image enhancement and performance enhancement drugs. But in order to mitigate the anticipated side effects, many were also using therapeutic drugs, whether it was Viagra to deal with erectile issues, or whether it was, say, mid-cycle or post-cycle treatments, tamoxifen, all these kinds of drugs to help alleviate, again, some of the unwanted side effects. But in addition to this, half of those we spoke to were also using psychoactive drugs, principally cannabis, cocaine, and ecstasy. If I go to a rave, I'll take MDMA, but it's probably about 3 or 4 times a year, so it's not very often. But when I do have a session on it, I hit it hard. I used to be on the cocaine every week, maybe 3 or 4 years, maybe more. I think the last time I used coke was about 2 months ago. Another individual we spoke to. I do take cocaine. I don't take it very regularly. I'll only take it if I'm out. But I do drink alcohol exactly the same as before. I wasn't using steroids. And I do smoke cannabis. And finally, the more extreme end of the spectrum in terms of their sort of psychoactive drug use. I had a fucking blowout the other day. I ended up eating 20 ecstasy tablets, drinking champagne, vodka, and all that. I had about 1/8 of cocaine as well. It's not good, is it? Is that a regular thing that you use these drugs? Is it recreational most weekends? Cocaine, definitely. Every weekend for the last 7 months. The second category then is to do with poor injection practices, and this was the idea that we had concerns about the sterility of the environment, the injection sites, and certain practices that individuals were engaged in. So here's a nice anecdote that many people seem to reference this same case. A member took steroids, but he didn't wipe his arm with alcohol wipes. He just banged it in like that. Half there, straight out, banged it in the other arm. He only gone and got an abscess, and he had to have a big chunk of his arm removed. His shoulder, he's got a big cut on his arm and his shoulder now. And this exchange that one of the researchers had with two of the older gym members is particularly illuminating. I never do it here. Why not? It's filthy. I've only been here a few days, and the amount of guys who are doing it here, yeah, but that's them, isn't it? Yeah, I wouldn't. Even though they wipe them with a sterile wipe, they're picking up something and this and that, and then they're blowing on it when they're injecting them. And I just think, germs, it's dirty. I know why they do that. It's because one lad did it, and then another lad copied it. And I thought, why are you blowing on this side? Actually, the research team was able to document this, not that exact case, but this practice with individuals, one individual who was injecting his friend, blowing on the injection site whilst injecting him steroids. The next thing is to do with the sort of regimens. The fact that many of those we spoke to had disclosed quite extended cycles. So whether that was 6 months, 7 months, 9 months, or more. Many also disclose high doses of drugs, and many also seem to suggest that certain batches of drugs that they'd taken had been a bit dodgy, and they were concerned with the quality of the drugs and what they were actually injecting. The longest I've used is over 12 months, just one course to the next, maybe even 18 months, something like that, until either you've got no money to buy a course, which generally isn't the case, or you need to stop. There's a lot of fakes going around now. I probably injected some shit trying to find one that worked well, but now I've found one that works well for me. I'm quite happy in the way that I do it. I don't need 12 weeks off. If you look at the Olympia lads, they never come off. If I was going to cycle, it should be 10 weeks off. So 12 weeks on, 6 weeks off, That's usually what they say, but you can stay on them all your fucking life if you want. It doesn't make no difference, does it? I've been using flat out for pretty much about 7 months, which isn't very good. It's time for a break. The final category of risk that we don't have an awful lot of time to delve into is to do with pre-existing or newly emergent medical conditions, which users disclosed to us. And they continued using IPEDs despite these risks. So there was some to do with mental health, whether it's to do with depression, panic, anxiety attack, but potentially more risky was physical health issues, continued use despite jaundice of the liver, individuals suffering blackouts or dizzy spells, erratic heartbeats, and individuals using despite having known heart conditions. So how is it that these IPED users were getting informed? Why is it that we documented so many high-risk behaviours amongst a group of people who were actively trying to educate themselves and trying to source information in terms of best practice and use? So information was sourced from 3 key areas. First was observing or speaking with fellow gym members and their experiential knowledge, or the knowledge of staff who worked there, and suppliers, people who sold it on, but also online posts, online forums. Now, for the most part, people first got their information from fellow members, staff, suppliers, and then would follow this up by going online, going on forums. It's not that these individuals are necessarily uninformed, but if anything, there was almost a proliferation of opinion and advice, and the information that they were exposed to was at times contradictory. What someone would tell you at the gym or what the supplier would tell you might contradict something that they'd read online, vice versa. So the vastness of opinion on offer was at times actually compounded by the fact that, as many said to us, everyone's body's different. Different doses or different combinations work differently for different users. And so what this meant was very often it boiled down to a sort of trial and error approach, which is what one individual termed it. Picking and choosing some advice, trialing it, seeing what the outcomes are. So that was part of the person who first supplied them to me was like, here you are, this is the perfect course for you. And obviously, I don't just take his word for it. I go away and research. I'm not naive like that. I will research about it. Just Google it. And that's true of almost all the guys we spoke to. They never took anyone's advice at face value. I used my training partner's experiential knowledge first. Then went into the readings and picked up bits, but it's hard. There's nothing out there proper. Like I say, it's called bro science. It's just off the lads. Compounding the problems of this proliferation of information and advice is the fact that certain individuals who we spoke to were uninterested in heeding any advice or educating themselves. And even if the right information could get to them, whether or not they took that on board is a separate issue. So this is from the gym owner on a commercial supply of steroids. I had a guy in here last night. He popped in because he was after some stuff. He was saying, oh, it's not really doing much for me at the moment. And I said to him, well, how long have you been on, mate? And he said, 42 weeks. I said, what, you've been on for 42 weeks? He said, yeah. I said, you don't have anything like HCG? No. I said to him, listen, mate, you need this, this, and this, and you need to come off cycle ASAP. But he just took everything with a pinch of salt. He's going to stay on, but that's his life, isn't it? I didn't know nothing about what I was using first time. I never read up on what I'm taking. I don't know. I just thought if it was that bad, people wouldn't sell it to you, really. So it can't be that bad. There's no point reading up on it. Everyone here uses it, so it can't be that bad or cause death or anything, really, I suppose. Now, this last example and this last quote I think is really important because it shows to an extent in this environment where use of these drugs is so widespread and normalized, that in itself is a direct and proxy indicator of practice and risks. The normalization of steroids in this person's social circle is, in their view, evidence enough that the drugs are safe. So why bother educating yourself about it? Just copy people. Do what they're doing. There are probably hundreds of fucking risks I don't know about. Do you feel like you want someone to fully inform you of the risks? Or I'm not really bothered, to be honest. I'm here for as long as I'm here, aren't I? Ultimately then, it came down to this. Most of the people we spoke to were aware of a range of risks that were there, that were present. But the rewards on offer from continuing use, from using extended cycles or using a whole range of drugs, going out and partying, outweighed the perceived risks. Now, partly it may be because many of these risks may be to some extent decoupled. You're not going to experience, heart failure potentially until your 60s. But if you've enjoyed your life and felt good throughout much of it, then that's the important thing. The rewards outweigh the perceived risks. And the rewards were pretty extensive. It wasn't just about physical gains, but it was about well-being. It was about the craft of shaping your body. It was about learning new techniques. It was about implementing these techniques, getting more skillful. It was about the fraternal society that existed in this place. And for some people, there was actually, it helped them deal with potential depression or anxiety or other mental health issues. The gym was therefore really prominent in these men's lives. And in light of that, the potential risks from excessive use or from use of, such quite extensive polypharmacy were not deemed serious. I'd say about 50 to 60% listen to what I've got to say and what the duty manager's got to say. For a lot of people who don't come off, it's not because they don't know the risks or the advice, it's because they're scared of losing their sights. So, sorry for that whistle top talk. I have had to cut quite a lot out. So in conclusion then, this presentation looked at the extensive range of concomitant behavioural risks that were identified during my team's ethnographic work in this independent bodybuilding gym. What we found is, to an extent, again, differences between individuals, but generally speaking, a subpopulation who on the one hand made lots of efforts to educate themselves on the use of these substances and also employed a range of risk mitigation techniques, but on the other hand, were willing to sort of trade off several perceived risks in favour of greater or sustained gains. Again, these gains weren't merely aesthetic, but personal well-being was often cited as a motive for intense personal regimes and continued IPEDs use. And again, that sort of supportive fraternal environment that existed was important. The risks that we identified were to do with the ever-evolving, often high-dose, often extended use of IPEDs, their concurrent use of therapeutic and psychoactive drugs, poor injection practices, and sustained use despite seeming medical risks. So, in conclusion, what is the policy challenge here? How do you deal, firstly, with the proliferation of opinion or information that is out there in order to get the right information to those who are trying to seek it out? How do you promote best practice to those users? And then further to that, how do you then go about engaging those, even amongst this cohort, who are unconcerned by the risks? Leave it there. Thank you.